let's talk about the basics of Photoshop. So, to get an understanding of Photoshop, the first thing which we already talked about, you need to know is that Photoshop is based on pixels. Okay, so we already understand that. We got that. Good. The second thing you need to understand Photoshop is you need to understand layers. Okay, so the way that Photoshop works is it's like a Z stack in a microscope. Okay, so if you have, say, a microscope and a sample and it takes a picture, oftentimes what confocal microscopes can do is they take one picture on this plane and then they can scan up and they take another picture on this plane and they scan up and they take another picture on this plane and they scan up and they take another picture on this plane. Okay, these are what in the microscope world you'd call layers or Z stacks. And Photoshop operates exactly the same way in that there are layers, okay? And in each of these layers, you get to put as many layers as you want, and you get to pick which content goes on what layer. So you might have a background layer, layer 0, which is just white, a white background, kind of like your piece of paper. And then you might create a layer 1 on top of that. And on that top, you might make a sketch. So if you're going to do like a flower, you might sketch out your flower. Okay. And then on layer 2, if the flower is yellow, you might add in your color. Okay. And then you might make a layer 3. And on layer 3, you might put in some details, some little, maybe there's some pollen grains that you see on each. Okay, and what you see, okay, when you look at this from the top, what you see then is something that would look like this. Okay, now the reason that this is important is because the layers and the fact that you can add in new layers. So I can make a 4th layer on top of this. The reason that this is important is because now I can start to do experiments. So I could say, imagine what it would look like if I added some red. And what you might see is it would look maybe something like this. And then you get to decide, do I like that red color that I just added on that 4th layer? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, you keep the layer. And if the answer is no, you just delete the layer. And then the red would, in theory, I can't do it in this program because this program doesn't have layers, okay? So this is a great example. This is a perfect example. I can no longer delete this red. I can't erase just the red here in this flower that I drew. And the reason I can't do it is because this flower is one layer, okay? Whereas over here in Photoshop, if I put that red on a separate layer, I could just simply delete the red if I didn't like it, okay? So the layers allow us to experiment and to try new things. And you can take a layer, so imagine you had that red layer again. You can take layers and you can swap them. So you could see, what does it look like if I pull the red below the yellow? And how does that change things? How does that change what I'm seeing? How does that change the patterns? So the layers give us amazing creative sort of expandability, and we can amplify the speed at which we can test things artistically, test experiments, draw certain colors, do certain shapes, and we can decide whether or not we like those things. And if we do like them, we can keep them, or if we don't like them, we can delete the layers, okay? So one of the things you really want to get used to in Photoshop is you really want to get used to the idea of if it's a new type of mark or a new type of color that you're going to be adding, create a new layer, and what you could say is aliquot or partition those marks to just that layer. And then if I ever get to the point where I want to edit some of the yellow, I can just go to the layer 2 and I can edit the yellow. Or if I want to get to the point where I need to edit the sketch, I can go to layer 1 and I can edit the sketch, okay, without changing any of the other marks that I've made. Whereas if I just had one layer and I need to edit this, now I'm having trouble because I'm editing the whole thing as a whole. So layers allow us to partition the artistic creation that we are making. So let me show you how to make a layer. Over here in Photoshop, you have what's called the Layers tab. Okay, that's right here on the right. And right now we just have one layer, and you'll notice there's this little padlock. That means this layer is locked. The background layer is locked as a white piece of paper. If I wanted to unlock that, I just press the lock. If I want to relock it, I press the lock again, and it will lock it. Locking a layer means you can no longer edit or touch that layer. So a lot of times people will encounter problems because they're trying to make marks or erase marks on a locked layer, okay? If it's locked, you can't change it. And you might want to lock a layer after you've perfected it so that you don't accidentally destroy the marks on that layer. Okay, so for this plan, let's plan that the first layer 0 will be this white sheet of paper. Let's create a new layer. So how you do this is you go up to the top, it says layer, new, layer. And we can give it a name. Let's just call it layer 1. You could name it as whatever you want. You could say red petals, you could say yellow petals, you could say pollen grains. You could name it whatever you wanted. Let's just call it layer 1. You could give it a color. And so here it is. Here's layer 1. Now let's make some marks on layer 1. So I'm just going to get the brush tool and I'm just going to make some marks. Or let's do the flower. Okay. So here's our flower. And now let's say we want to add color. So let's make a new layer. Let's call this layer 2. But notice what will happen now if I say I'm going to make a red flower. So now I'm going to color over top. And you see I can color over top the black marks. Okay, and that's because layer 2 is on top of layer 1. Okay, so now I want you to see what happens. Let me just quickly fill this thing in. I want you to see what happens when we change which layer is on top of the other. Okay, so right now I'm sort of covering up what might have been my sketch by painting on top of it. If I were to move this layer just by clicking it and move it underneath, now you see that my sketch comes first and foremost. So you can see how we can change the properties of how things look in Photoshop simply by moving the layers and creatively arranging the marks in a proper layer order. Okay. Now let's create a layer again. New layer, layer. Let's do layer 3. This is going to be a layer for the pollen grains. Okay, so let's make some, let's change our color here. Let's make some black pollen grain marks on this flower. And I want you to notice how even this is such a quick, just a dumb kind of little flower, but you'll notice that just as I continue to increase the complexity, as I continue to add more layers, the picture starts to get more interesting, even though this is just a dumb little sketch. And this is true for all scientific illustration, is that as you go forward in your projects, the more layers you create and the more detail you experiment with, the better the quality of your image is going to be. So I can just tell based on kind of like quantitatively how many marks people make, how many layers they have. So it's a real good strategy to try to just add detail layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, and eventually your picture will become even better. Okay, so let me show you now a cool effect. So let's say we want to add some shading. Okay, so let's say layer, let's add another layer, a new layer, and let's put this layer on top of the red. Okay, so layer 4 is now on top of the red, and I want to do some shading. So imagine I want to add some different tones of red or some purple. Let's add some purple, okay? Because purple's like kind of red. And what I want to do is take my brush and I'm gonna paint some purple, okay? And I'm gonna show you a cool effect. So let's paint some purple. Now what I can do is each of these layers over here on the right, on the layer tab, each of these layers has its own properties. I can shut layers on and off by pressing this eyeball, okay, whether or not I can see them. So I can experiment. I can make a layer and I can see, do I prefer it better like this with red? Or do I prefer it with a little bit of the purple? Do I prefer it without the red or with the red? Do I prefer it with the marks, the pollen grains, or without the pollen grains? So this is a great way for us to test sort of little experiments that we want to artistically create. And let me show you another property of layers. So layers have a property called opacity, and I use this all the time, okay? You might not like this much purple, okay? And you might think to yourself, well, I want to decrease the amount of purple that's on that layer. So what you can do is you can decrease the layer opacity. And so what you'll see is at 0 opacity, the layer's invisible. Okay, at 50% opacity, it's essentially creating a screen. Okay, so if we decrease the yellow layer opacity here to 50%, that means what's happening is light is able to pass through this, and you can see through to the bottom layer underneath. So we can change actually the transparency of a layer by manipulating the layer opacity, okay? And so you might decide, well, this purple's a little bit too much, although I kind of like that. It kind of looks pretty good. I might want to just smooth it out a little bit, okay? And then let's have that opacity is now at 70%. That looks pretty good. Now let's see what happens when we bring the sketch layer on top. Well, that looks pretty bad. So let's bring that back down. Okay. So do you see how we can do these experiments and we can decide what we like and the proper way to construct the things that we are drawing. So start to have your brain think in layers. Now, the layers are both a blessing and a curse, because what you're going to find is if you're not comfortable with the layers right away, what you're going to start to do is you're going to be on one layer. So you're going to be on layer 4, and you're going to think to yourself, I want to erase these black marks. So you're going to grab your eraser and you're going to try to erase, and you're going to be like, oh crap, I did not erase the black marks. How can I erase the black marks? I can't get them. I can't touch them. And the reason you can't get them and you can't touch them is because you're not on the layer with the black marks. So you have to actually select the layer with the black marks if you want to erase those black marks, okay? So you're going to get into problems where once you have, I've seen students that eventually have like hundreds and hundreds of layers. And you're going to get to an issue where it's hard for you to find which layer has which marks that you want to edit, okay? So a trick is, once you sort of get satisfied with a certain stage or a certain part of your project, you can merge layers. So if I'm completely satisfied with all these layers, I can select them. The way that I select them is I click one, I hold the shift key on my computer, and then I click another one, and it's going to allow me to select all the layers that I want. And I can right click, and I can click this option called merge layers, okay? And that merges them all together. And now this entire piece is one object. So we've essentially merged it into this thing that I talked about. And there's pluses and minuses to this. The plus is that it's easier to work with. This is just one layer now. I can shut it on and off. The downside is I can't edit these individual marks anymore. So if I want to edit out those black marks, that's not what I can't do that. I cannot just edit out those black marks, okay? So there's pluses and minuses to merging layers. And I would encourage you, there isn't a set rule. You need to learn what gets you comfortable. If your computer starts to slow down and you can't handle it, you need to merge some layers, okay? So you just keep that in mind. Now let me just show one more option with a layer. If you just want to merge two layers, like let's say we just want to we want the marks. Let's see, what would it look like if we put? Let's say we want to merge the two color layers together, and we want to keep the marks separate. Okay, you can just click, and you can right click, and then you can click merge down, and then it's going to merge the layer on top to the layer immediately below it. And now we have a layer of color, which we can turn on and off. Okay, so that's another common thing that I'm doing with layers. Most commonly what I'm doing is I'm fiddling with the opacity. I'm separating my layers to make different kinds of marks. Different colors go on different layers. Different things that I'm drawing go on different layers. I might put the insect legs on a certain layer. I might put the insect wing on a layer. And if you start to draw things, what you'll notice is that, right, if I'm going to draw a stem, for this flower, okay, the stem layer needs to be behind, okay? So this is incorrect. So you want to organize your layers sort of how your eye sees it. So if I want to draw a stem, I would create a new layer, stem layer. Let's label it as stem layer. I would bring it underneath, and then I would draw the stem. You see? And then now the stem is actually the full length, okay? But I can put it behind such that it looks proper, okay? So you want to start to learn, teach your brain to think in layers and construct your layers in a way that your eye sees things. Think about the stack, the Z stack, and construct your image in the way that you are seeing it from top to the bottom.